Welcome to the War of 1812. This is perhaps, certainly one of my favorite wars to teach because it's so underwhelming in the way that it's covered in most history books. And in fact, it's really important. It's also easier to do a presentation on in great detail because it hasn't been overdone. There's not too much of it to go around. So, without further ado, let's get into this. So from this map, what problems can you see? These solid yellow ones here, this is the 13 original colonies. The yellow outlines over here, these outline territory ceded to the U.S. at the end of the war, 1783. The diagonal stripes right here by Maine and Massachusetts, this is territory that's in dispute with the British. All of these pink outlines are British territories, and the green outlines down here are Spanish territories. There's absolutely no standing military at this time. There's a need to secure peace with the American Indians. We have Spanish to the southwest, English to the north, and with no standing military prior to the War of 1812, this is a big problem. How is it possible for us to even stay in existence? How long did the War of 1812 last? Silly question, right? No, wrong. It is not a silly question. It just sounds silly. It actually lasts 32 months. That's nearly 3 whole years. From 1812 to 1815. And what exactly were the reasons for the War of 1812? Well, let's get to that step by step. First, let's talk about trade restrictions. Napoleon declared war on England in 1803. Both sides, France and England, interfered with American trade. The Brits were by far the worst, though. The Royal Navy seized more than 500 American vessels between 1803 and 1807. The Brits continued to impose a virtual blockade of the coast. Jefferson's initial response, the Embargo Act, prohibited all exports to little effect. Now consider for a moment, what reasons would we have to side with the British, and what reasons would we have to side with the French in the Napoleonic Wars? With the British, with the English rather, we share a common heritage. However, with the French, we share the Treaty of 1778 and the ideology, which is anti-monarchy. A second reason leading to the War of 1812, impressment. That is not like impressing somebody exactly. Impressment is taking Americans off of American vessels and demanding that they become British soldiers. It is because a large part of England still does not recognize the United States as its own country. Culturally, they have not crossed that threshold. So when there's an American ship, if a British ship takes it over, demanding that the captives just become British sailors because they're simply pirates as far as the ship is concerned, is what happens. So American sailors are essentially being kidnapped and forced into a foreign military. And here we have what I think is probably the final nail in the coffin leading to the War of 1812, British aid to the American Indians. Tecumseh, the Shawnee chief who tried to revitalize the Indian Confederacy, was receiving direct support from Britain. British supplies were found at Indian outposts, including Prophetstown, the place William Henry Harrison, governor of Indiana Territory, burned to the ground. So think about this. Not in terms of Native American rights, which is a very, very fair issue, but in terms of this particular conflict, this particular war, from the perspective of the American colonists, Native Americans were an enemy, and Britain is feeding supplies to that enemy. There's some serious debate among historians on this as a possible motivation for the War of 1812. There surely were people in the colonies who wanted to annex Canada. However, my personal feeling is that taking on the British Navy to annex more colonies when the first 13 are struggling to stay alive would be silly, would be political suicide. However, some people have suggested that American colonial desire to annex Canada also prompted the War of 1812. And all this leads up to the declaration of war. In light of this, consider the American military in 1812. We do muster up a standing military by the time the war actually happens. And this is our sorry excuse for a standing military. We have a regular army of 12,000. We've got all kinds of volunteers and militia, but they're completely disorganized, unaccounted for. And our Navy has 16 ships. Now, in case you don't actually have a concept of, what numbers looked like then, which is perfectly justified, in contrast to our 16 ships, the Royal Navy had around 1,000. Not 10, not 100, 1,000. Now, what's happening in this map, the major northern campaigns of the War of 1812? Well, if you look closely, you'll see there's a three-pronged approach. One is marching out of Detroit, another along the Niagara River, and a third is marching toward Montreal. There are lots of problems coordinating between them. Think about the lack of technology at this time. Think about how communication was achieved at all. From Detroit, we have General William Hull. The Brits were in control of Lakes Erie and Ontario, and they blocked our supplies by water. The Brits captured the fort. Hull feared thousands of American Indians and surrendered in mid-August. On Hull's orders, the Fort Dearborn garrison evacuated its post and then were slaughtered by American Indians. The successor to Hull, William Henry Harrison, could not salvage the situation. Now, the Niagara March has General Stephen van Rensselaer. He's a political appointee with no military experience, which raises some questions, Should military officers be appointed rather than rising among the ranks? That's not a good discussion question. The answer is too obvious. Mid-October, General Stephen van Rensselaer attacks Queenston. There's some initial success. Militia reinforcements, though, refuse to cross the river into a foreign country. This is one of the limitations of militia. They don't go out of the country, even on foot. So the British counterattacked and won the Battle of Queenston Heights. The successor, General Alexander Smith, didn't accomplish anything either. And finally, on this three-pronged approach, we've got Montreal. General Henry Dearborn it moves slowly northward. At the Canadian border, again, militiamen would go no further. When they returned to their winter quarters, nothing accomplished. So taking a break from battles at a moment, which, as you can tell, were kind of dull and pointless up till this point, let's talk about Miss Lucy Brewer. Does anybody know when the Marines first began allowing women to enlist? The first woman to enlist in the Marines is Opha May Johnson, not Miss Lucy Brewer. 1918, World War I, Opha May Johnson enlisted in the Marine Corps Reserve. Lucy Brewer here is supposedly a cross-dressing Marine in 1812 on the USS Constitution. Lucy Brewer supposedly dressed up as a male and served on the USS Constitution. However, there are problems with this story. Lucy Brewer was supposedly on the ship for 3 years. Now, do you think she could really disguise her gender for that long? My dad was on submarines in the Navy, and everybody saw everything. Like, there was no way to hide what your genitalia were. No way. So that's questionable. What kind of privacy really exists on a ship? And what were the toilet facilities like at the time? My dad was in the Navy in the 1970s. I can only imagine what it was like in 1812. She's thought to actually be the creation of an author, Nathaniel Hill Wright. I want you to think about something, and this would be an interesting discussion to have, but I would want you to actually look up some solid information about it. Why was this story such a success? Why did it take off? Why did people of both sexes really want to believe that this was true at the time? So, some problems with the War of 1812. Pictured, you see Madison, President James Madison. He's an extremely weak commander-in-chief as far as, military commander-in-chief goes. It is part of being president, and he's lousy at it. In general, the officers in the military at the time are veterans of the Revolutionary War. Most of them are over 60 years old. Madison's governed by Republican principles of the time. The military is cheaply run. There's a distaste for standing forces, and there's a strong opposition to national debt. He failed to formulate an adequate taxation system, which, regardless of your political beliefs, in any era, taxes are necessary to fund a military if you're going to have one. There's a lot of factionalism at the time. The generals that did exist rarely cooperated with one another. Navy and Army officers ignored one another's concerns, and no government agency for planning intra- and inter-service coordination existed. Can you tell me what agency does that now? I hope you can. According to Madison's administration, conquering Canada was the key. And this is where we get this business about annexing Canada, by the way. But it's from a really ill-informed, sort of idiot administration. The hope was that if we conquered Canada, Britain would make concessions in order to regain it. The coastal localities didn't give a damn about Canada. They were more concerned with local threats, including naval raids, the Creek Indians in the southwest, and Tecumseh's Confederacy in the northwest. You've also got Federalists at this time. They are unilaterally opposed to the war. They provide supplies to Britain through Canada. These are American Federalists, citizens of the United States. The New England Federalists at the Hartford Convention implied that New England might secede from the rest of the U.S. Federalists carried on trade with England all through the war. New England governors at the time were Federalists, and New England's militia was the best in the country, so this is a huge problem. The governors of New England refused to cooperate, so militias were completely unavailable, and that crippled our national defense. This is one limitation of an online class. I can't write on this slide what you tell me. I hope to hear your thoughts, though, regarding, is this the Second War for Independence? It's what I call it. It's what other historians call it. But why? Why do you think this is the Second War for Independence? I would actually suggest that the War of 1812 is more important than the American Revolution, and that the War of 1812 is why we are still in existence as the United States today. Without the War of 1812, I think we would have faded into a little rebellion and we'd still have the Queen on our money. We don't. So the War of 1812 is important. Think about to yourself, why? Why would I say this? Maybe do some Googling, read some documents in the book. I'd be very curious as to your opinion on this. The War of 1812 in Maine. I'm always interested in localizing history, and we are indeed in Maine. Does anyone know what was going on in Maine at this time? Maine is a part of Massachusetts still. It's a base of operations for smuggling between Britain and the U.S. In September of 1813, the USS Enterprise, not the Star Trek one, captured the British Boxer off the coast of Pemaquid Point. In July of 1814, Sir Thomas Masterman Hardy took Moose Island, which is present-day Eastport, Maine. Took it without a shot. Entire Fort Sullivan surrendered. Sir John Sherbrooke led 3,000 troops on the Penobscot expedition. That included Hamden, Bangor, Machias, destroyed and captured 17 American ships, and the British occupied Castine for the rest of the war. The Battle of Bladensburg. It's 1814, and Napoleon had finally been defeated. There were more British troops available for North America. The beginning of the British Chesapeake Bay offensive happens here. General Robert Ross controlled the British land forces. General Alexander Cochrane controlled the British naval forces. And they marched toward Washington. Washington is undefended because the U.S. Secretary of War John Armstrong thought it was strategically unimportant, instead centering his defenses at Baltimore. The U.S. scrambled to organize militia forces under General William H. Winder. They neglected even obvious delaying tactics like destroying bridges. The hardest fighting occurred between American militiamen Joshua Barney's gunboat flotilla, which is 500 sailors, forced to disembark and fight with the British. The British quickly outflanked the entire operation, and even the seamen retreated. It burned the Capitol building as well as the White House to the ground, and continued marching toward Baltimore. Now, why would you think that Washington was actually strategically important or unimportant? I will say that in today's world, Washington is hugely important as a symbol. And then I would suggest that it was also. However, with the lack of mass media then that we now have today, there are some differences, really. If Washington, D.C. was destroyed today, we would all be watching it on television. And it would be a disaster. It would ruin morale. It would be a tragedy. It would change the way that we looked at things. There's some extent of that then. I think it was a mistake to think of Washington as strategically unimportant. However, perhaps less so than it would be today. Andrew Jackson leads the New Orleans offensive. This guy is a stubborn mule. Through sheer determination and self-direction, he had won the war with the Creek Nation, with no backup from any other part of the United States, really. The Creeks had seized the opportunity presented by the U.S. and British fighting in order to regain territory. Andrew Jackson is responsible for stopping Britain's venture into New Orleans. There are more details on Jackson in the book that you should check out. This is a formal painting of the Treaty of Ghent. Now here's a funny little trivia note for you. Russia offered to mediate between Britain and the United States. The U.S. accepted, but Britain did not, instead suggesting direct negotiations. Madison accepted. Now understand, by this time, following the Napoleonic Wars, England's population was weary of war. They really feared a renewed war with the French. Squabbling with potential allies seemed counterintuitive. So, even though I have mentioned how important I really do think this war was, can we say which side got victory? I mean, us, because we're still around, right? But the terms with Britain were really a cessation of hostilities, nothing more. The European war is over, so British violations of neutral rights, meaning impressment, ceased. Because one of the motivations for impressment on the part of the British was because they needed more soldiers to fight with the French. So why not just jack the Americans? But the European war is over, so those violations of neutral rights are now more hassle than they're worth. The U.S. did not acquire Canada, whatever Madison thought. The U.S. escaped territorial losses. Tecumseh's Confederation in the West and South was defeated. New England's influence over the rest of the country waned. And ultimately, what happened, that's important. We fought again with England, and we still emerged as a separate nation. So even though victory's a big word, just to say, hey, everything basically went back to what it officially was before, the important thing is we actually stayed a country. We didn't go away. One undeniably lasting effect of the war is the Star-Spangled Banner. And this is from the Battle of Baltimore. The flag was raised September 14th, 1814 at Fort McHenry to signify U.S. victory. You'll notice on here there are 15 stars and 15 stripes. This flag is originally 32 by 40 feet, half the size of a basketball court. This is what's left of it, and it's in the Smithsonian. Additional stars, to make it 15 instead of 13, signify Vermont and Kentucky joining the Union. And this is the battle that inspired Francis Scott Key's Star-Spangled Banner, that is our national anthem today. So here's your essay assignment for this week. What, according to Andrew Jackson, is different about the American way of war? How is American war a crusade? What is total victory? What did it mean in regard to the War of 1812? And does total victory have any meaning today? How could it carry over into American warfare today? Is it even possible? I'm interested in your thoughts. I look forward to hearing them.